It is a pleasure to be here. The full biographies of our very distinguished panelists are in the program, so I'm going to introduce them only very briefly. First, on my left, Jennifer Chang Newell is a senior staff attorney with the ACLU's National Immigrants' Rights Project. Next, Amy Nice is the executive director of immigration policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. One step over, Ali Noorani is the executive director of the National Immigration Forum. And last but not least, Jan Ting is a professor of law at the Temple University Beasley School of Law. So what we have in mind for today is that we're going to go in alphabetical order. Each of us is going to speak for no more than 7 minutes sharp. And after that, each of us will have the opportunity to speak for 2 minutes to respond to the comments of the other panelists, and then we will have time for questions from the audience. We're going to go in alphabetical order. That means I get to go first, so I'm going to start. I do not claim to have an answer to what our immigration policy should be, but I do want to propose to you that Asian Pacific Americans should be suspicious of restrictive immigration policies and should wonder if ungenerous policies or economically irrational policies are covers for racial discrimination. The reason for my suspicion is that federal immigration law was invented in large part to respond to the yellow peril, to keep Asians out of the country, and it focused on that goal for the better part of 2 centuries. Our story begins in 1790. One of the first actions of the first Congress, which was comprised of the framers of our Constitution, was to pass a law restricting citizenship by naturalization to free white persons. George Washington signed the law as president, John Adams signed the law as president of the Senate, and Thomas Jefferson signed it as Secretary of State. From 1790 to 1952, federal law prohibited some or all Asians in the United States from becoming naturalized citizens. In 1922, a unanimous Supreme Court explained that the prohibition of Asian naturalization was a rule enforced from the beginning of the government, a part of our history as well as our law, welded into the structure of our national polity by a century of legislative and administrative acts and judicial decisions. From 1862 to 1965, federal law prohibited or restricted the immigration of Asians. This is tremendously important because throughout most of that period, the borders were open. There were no quantitative limits on the number of people who could come to the United States. So every European, every South American, every African who wanted to come could come without numerical limitation. There was a high demand for labor during much of this period. Many parts of the country were unpopulated, so all were welcome except Asians. And the result of this policy is that notwithstanding certain exceptions to the rule, Asians are a very small minority in the United States today. The Asian exclusion laws were race-based. They started with the Chinese, but that was a coincidence. As Japanese and Asian Indians started to immigrate to the United States, the laws were expanded to exclude them as well, and ultimately the laws prohibited the immigration of all persons whose ancestry traced to any Asian country. The Asian exclusion laws applied based on race, not citizenship or place of birth, like other immigration laws. So a person whose ancestors were English, who was born in Chile, was treated as Chilean. A person whose ancestors were English, born in China, was treated as English, not Chinese. But a person whose ancestors were Korean, born in England or Chile or anywhere else in the world, was treated as Korean because of their racial ancestry and excluded from the United States. The Asian exclusion laws were explicitly based on race superiority. Senator Miller of California, speaking in favor of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, offered a fairly typical view. He said, "It is not numbers that are needed. Quality is more important than quantity. One complete man, the product of free institutions and high civilization, is worth more to the world than hundreds of barbarians. Upon what other theory can we justify the almost complete extermination of the Indian, the original possessor of all these states? I believe that one such man as Newton or Franklin or Lincoln glorifies the creator of the world and benefits mankind more than all the Chinese who have lived, struggled, and died on the banks of the Wang Ho. So U.S. policy changed in 1965. There was a new Immigration Act, and race was taken out of immigration policy and naturalization policy for the first time since the founding of the country. Before 1965, 80% or more of the immigrant stream was white. After 1965, 80% or more of immigrants are Latino or Asian. I myself think that race neutrality as an immigration policy is good. Here's what's not so good. Before 1965, when most immigrants were white, the law was very soft on deportation, on people who were out of status. Undocumented or deportable immigrants were thought of and treated as bone of our bone, flesh of our flesh. Grounds for deportation were much fewer. There were many more opportunities for relief. For example, sentencing judges in state and federal criminal cases could wave a magic wand and make a person convicted of a crime non-deportable. Many of the grounds for relief were explicitly restricted by race. A white illegal alien could stay. One whose ancestors were from India or another Asian country could not. As the immigrant stream has become more diverse, we see deportation policy and law becoming harsher. There are many more grounds for mandatory deportation, many fewer opportunities for relief, fewer procedural protections. I find it hard to believe that the race of those affected isn't part of the political reality. There are 11 million or so undocumented people in the United States, including 1 million or so of Asian ancestry, many more of Mexican or South American birth. What I ask you to think about is that if these undocumented people were Canadian or Irish, would there be the same level of anxiety about their presence? Would there be more willingness to say now, as there was in past decades and centuries, that because their transgressions are technical, there is no great harm in overlooking them and letting them stay? And what are the implications of the answers to those questions on our policy going forward? So that is my 7 minutes, and now I will turn the microphone over to Jennifer Chang Newell. Thank you.
So I'm going to spend 7 minutes talking about the federal government's family detention policies. Over the past year, we've seen a 361% increase in the number of families apprehended after crossing the southern border. And most of these families are from Central America, from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. And a huge proportion of these migrants are fleeing violence, domestic abuse, and dangerous gang-related activity in their home countries. The U.S. government's response to this humanitarian situation at the border was a campaign to stem the flow and send a message of deterrence through expedited detention and removal without regard for individual circumstances. And at the highest levels of our government, up to the President, the Department of Homeland Security Secretary, they have said to these asylum seekers, and they've said repeatedly and publicly, we will send you back. So the government began detaining these families at unprecedented levels. Before this surge, there were only 85 family detention immigration beds in the entire United States. Today, there's over 2,000 beds with plans to expand to about 4,000 in the next 2 months. The government's political calculus appears to be that maximum enforcement at all costs, locking up women and children, is the price for comprehensive immigration reform and wide-scale administrative relief. But at this point, all we've seen is the vast human cost. So Artesia is a federal family detention facility in Artesia, New Mexico. It's a makeshift facility that is located in several large trailers on the campus of a federal law enforcement training center. It is literally in the middle of nowhere. It was the first family detention center that the government opened in response to this surge. It is 4 hours from the nearest major city. And in a 45-mile radius, there was one Spanish-speaking attorney who did not practice immigration law when this facility first opened. I went there in July, just a few weeks after it opened, and we interviewed mothers and children from El Salvador, all of whom were fleeing horrific violence. And their stories were incredibly difficult to hear. At the same time, they had other troubling things to reveal. So many of the women had been ordered deported without any legal rights information, any understanding of what was happening to them. They had no help from an attorney and no idea of how to get one. Their phone calls were cut off by ICE guards after 3 minutes, after 5 minutes. They were subjected to asylum interviews in which they were breastfeeding their babies and disciplining their toddlers while asylum officers were asking them about the sexual abuse that they suffered at home. It was clear to us advocates that what was happening at Artesia was a tragedy. Women and children were being sent back to extreme danger without a fair hearing, and this was un-American. And so we had to do something, and someone had to do something, so we decided to sue them. We sued them in August, alleging that the deportation procedures that the government is using at Artesia violate the Immigration and Nationality Act, its regulations, and the Due Process Clause. What will happen in our litigation is definitely still a question mark. But what we know is happening is that families of asylum seekers are being locked up to send a message. So in closing, I will just say a few words about our lead plaintiff, who I'll call MSPC. She is a 20-year-old breastfeeding mother who fled death threats and severe domestic abuse in El Salvador. She and her baby have been detained for 4 months in Artesia. Her baby, who was about 8 months old when they first arrived, has lost several pounds while they've been detained there. He took his first steps there, and he celebrated his first birthday there. Her story is heartbreaking, but of the almost 600 women and children detained at Artesia, her story is not unique. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to spend my 7 minutes talking about what is the reasons the business community supports immigration reform, and in particular, in the coming Congress, what are some of the things that we're thinking about focusing on. I'm going to start with the second. In this last Congress, at the U.S. Chamber and with our many partners, including the National Immigration Forum and lots of other groups, and our company members, trade associations, we certainly made a lot of progress, but obviously we didn't get over the finish line. One of the things that, or there are 3 things that I want to identify that I think we all need to do a better job of educating our elected representatives about. Some of them actually touch on some of the points that Jack made about our law, which I think we've got to the point where people in Congress are no longer talking about, do we really need to reform our immigration system? And they're engaged in talking about how to do it. But there's some other things that people really don't understand. One point is, before 1921, as Jack pointed out, there were no numerical limits in our immigration law. The immigration law was only written to identify who can't come. And since 1921, we have a law that sets a limit on the total number of immigrants, and then a limit on how we're going to distribute those numbers. And as you all know, we started out in 1921 with the idea that we were going to base the total number as a percentage of the people that lived in our country according to the census, and then distribute the visas according to the national origin distribution of the people that lived in our country according to the census. Then we decided that maybe that census had a little bit too much diversity, so in 1924 we went back to the 1890 census, reduced the percentage, and we stayed with that same law until 1965. The point is, every law since 1921, even the major reforms in 1952, which is the current statute that we make all of our subsequent amendments on, the 1965 law, 1986, 1990. We are still working with a Congress that only is thinking about immigration in terms of what are the total number of immigrants and what country are they coming from. We need to start thinking about, in the 21st century, what skills do we need in our country? What entrepreneurs do we need in our country? What should we be counting, and what should we not be counting? What should we provide an accounting of, but we don't care how many there are that come in? So point number one is, we're at the U.S. Chamber going to be really working on this idea of trying to get Congress to focus away from our job is to set numerical limits. Number two, the law as we have it today, and as I've become more and more familiar with it in this job, I was in private practice as a business immigration lawyer, did not understand this after 23 years of being a business immigration lawyer. Our law that we have today is layer upon layer upon layer of this, but with a same fundamental 1952 law, which is just an amendment and a new reconstruction of what we did in 1921. So we have a jalopy. We have a Model T, and we keep putting new wheels on it, maybe a new engine, but we need to actually just not have our Congress limited to, I'm going to make an amendment in this one subsection with the hope that the result is X, Y, and Z. One of the things that I heard a lot in the last Congress, in this Congress, sorry, I'm already pretending like it is over. One of the things I heard a lot in more than 125 meetings with Republican members of the House is that they really believe that the bills that are coming out of the Senate, and there's been, we had the comprehensive one in 2013, comprehensive in 2007, comprehensive in 2006, that there's just some kind of legal finagling, loopholes. It's too complicated and big, and we all know to avoid the word comprehensive. But the point is, it's a layer upon layer. There's some truth in the idea that it's very complicated. Let's focus on what we need, write what we need, and get rid of some of these layers. So I'm not even going to get back to the why the business community supports immigration reform, but we'll talk about it in our conversation. I just want to make my third point about which we focus on going forward. One, that we have too much focus on numerical limits. Two, that we have layers upon layers. And three, our entire immigration law today is focused on the idea that we should only admit immigrants that have ties to our country. If you have an employer that can sponsor you, if you have a family member that can sponsor you, or you're fleeing persecution and you're a refugee. Our businesses, our members, don't think that it's sensible or even defensible that of the approximately 1 million immigrants a year, there are only 59,000 that are workers that were selected because of their skills and the jobs that they're going to perform in the economy. We need to figure out other ways to communicate that focus in our law and not limit the people who can come here and work and provide skills and training and add to our economy based only on the people who already have a contact here. We all know that many of our ancestors came here and they didn't know anybody. Let's not limit it to just the people who can document those relationships. Okay, now we're going to introduce.
Next up is Ali Noorani.
Thank you, Jack. How's everybody? So to a room full of lawyers, I'm going to say something that you're probably going to boo me right off the stage from the get-go. Ready? Look at that. No more eating. Immigration is not about the law. It's not about the law. At its core, immigration is a cultural conversation. It is a cultural debate. Yes, ultimately, it is about the law and what we as a nation of laws allow to happen. But at its core, this is a cultural debate about who we are as a country. My parents came from Pakistan, and I'm sitting up here saying, realizing that for me at least, this is the first time in a long time I've had the honor of speaking to a room full of folks who share a story like mine. You know, it was our parents, our grandparents who came from someplace else, or we came from someplace else, to make, you know, our families run at the American dream. And, you know, that's a really special thing. But it is a cultural change that all of us have helped this country go through. And it's that cultural debate that continues to roil what happens in Congress. So for me, over the last 6 months, the moment that I keep thinking about is that first week of July. Now remember, this summer is when, you know, the issue of unaccompanied minors and the border crisis really came up and dominated the debate. Now you remember that first week in July and those pictures from Murrieta, California? Remember that? The protesters standing in front of the buses in Murrieta? Well, that was Tuesday. On Thursday at the White House, there was an event where members of the armed services were being naturalized as U.S. citizens. So in a span of less than a week, we saw the worst of our nation's cultural debate around immigration and the best. So that moment in July for us, and I think for all of us, defined this question. It defined the challenge. And when you look at the polling numbers, the Public Religion Research Institute has done week-by-week polling across the country. We saw that over the, you know, going into the summer, say around 65% of people felt that immigrants and immigration were a benefit to the country. In June and July, as the border crisis dominated the debate and, you know, the opponents of immigrants and immigration demagogued that issue, you saw public support for immigrants and immigration starts to decline. So you saw that number get closer to 50%. You saw the number of people who think that immigrants are a burden get closer to 50%. So we went from a 20-point difference between support and opposition to around a 7-point difference. And the only reason I think that changed is because of that week. It's because the American public had to look at that picture of what was happening in Murrieta, California, and ask themselves, where would I be in that picture? And they saw the picture on Thursday later that week, and they said, where would I want to be in that picture? That's what we're facing. It's a cultural debate. So how do we have this cultural debate? We think that at the National Immigration Forum, it is a matter of engaging the broadest swath of the country that we can. So we've worked now across the country with conservative faith, law enforcement, and business leaders to engage them in this cultural conversation about where we're going as a country. And the values proposition that people are grappling with is that for America to thrive, new Americans must have the opportunities, the skills, and the status to reach their fullest potential. And I think all of us in this room, all of our friends, our neighbors, our families are a definition of our communities thriving because all of us have reached our fullest potential. So what does that mean at this political moment? Because, you know, as you can probably tell from the outset, my first comment, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm kind of the token non-lawyer on TV. Yeah, but I play one on TV, I think. So where are we at this point politically? So apparently there was an election a few days ago. Anybody hear about that? Okay. And apparently some new folks got elected and some old folks were defeated. So what we're facing right now is that, you know, Republicans control the House and the Senate. There will be 43 Republicans in the House and 52 in the Senate. So Boehner and McConnell in the House and the Senate respectively will determine the agenda of Congress in 2015 and 16. In the next, I think, 6 to 8 weeks, we're going to see the president move forward with some sort of executive action that we think will stabilize the economy, stabilize the workforce, and keep families together. We think that's a good thing. But how do Republicans respond? At this point, Republicans are saying, if the president acts, it will poison the well. Well, I hate to break it to everybody, but that well hasn't had water for decades. And both parties, in our opinion, are responsible for that. So the case that we make in a cultural way and a political way, eventually leading to policy change, is that 2015 is the opportunity for Republicans to take credit for fixing the immigration system. Because the other thing that happened going into this week's election is that the Asian community, as an electoral force, really began to emerge. Races in Texas, Georgia, New Jersey, Virginia, all started to see an uptick in expenditures by candidates aiming at the Asian community, the Asian electorate. So if Republicans want credit for fixing the immigration system, this is their opportunity to do so. And they can go back to Asian voters, Latino voters, white voters, and say, you know what? We were in charge, we saw this problem, and we solved it. So they can get credit for fixing the system, or they can get credit for trying to undermine and dismantle whatever the president does. And the only reason I think that they will move forward with a solution is if all of us and our colleagues at our businesses, our friends and neighbors, engage in this cultural debate. It is a cultural debate about where we are going as a country and our respective contributions to it. Getting into a policy debate, yes, is important, and it's a big part of all of what we do on a day-to-day basis. But at the end of the day, everybody who's not in this room, who may not have that recent immigrant experience, they want to know how and why their country is changing. And it's because all of us are part of the same country, and we're all in this and changing it together. So our bottom line is that, yes, this is ultimately about the law, but it's about how we have this conversation and how we go as a country. Thank you.
Our last speaker is Professor Jan Ting.
Thanks. Great to be here. Let me start by saying both my parents were immigrants who came from China during the time of Chinese exclusion. And like most immigrants, they have a great story to tell. I grew up in a working class neighborhood around Detroit where all of my classmates seemed to have either a parent or a grandparent living at home who was born somewhere else. It was like a mini United Nations. So of course, I grew up admiring and respecting immigrants. And we all should, because we know that all Americans are either immigrants themselves or descendants of ancestors that came here from somewhere else, and we're told that's true even of Native Americans. So of course we admire and respect immigrants. That's not the issue. That's not the issue, although some people say that it is. The issue is, given the fact that we admire and respect immigrants, how many immigrants are we willing to take every year? Right? How many? That's the issue. And the reason our immigration system seems broken, I don't think it is, but the reason it seems broken is because we can't make up our minds what the answer to that question is. That is the fundamental question at the root of why immigration is always going to be a troubling issue, because we can't make up our minds. On the one hand, should we have no limit on immigration? I mean, I think there are a lot of reasons. Or on the other hand, should we enforce a numerical limit on immigration every year? That's the choice. You know, I'm a lawyer. A lot of lawyers think they can argue both sides of every question. Me too, right? I can make the argument for no limits on immigration. And I think it is an honorable and intellectually defensible position. It's a coherent position. There are a lot of reasons, as Jack has said. You know, for 100 years, the country was founded on open immigration. There are historical reasons, there are utilitarian reasons, what's good for the most people. There's social justice reasons, what's good for the poorest people in the world. No limits on immigration. There's religious reasons. What would Jesus' immigration policy look like? There are philosophical reasons. This country is all about maximizing individual freedom. What immigration policy will maximize individual freedom? Let everyone make up their own minds where they're going to live. And there's also the saving taxpayers' money issue. You know, Center for Migration Studies says we're spending $18 billion taxpayer dollars a year trying to enforce our immigration laws. Stop enforcing them. Save $18 billion taxpayer dollars a year. And of course, we can keep labor laws down, labor costs down by having unlimited immigration come into the United States. If labor costs are low, profits are up. Guess what? The stock market is hitting record highs every week. Yahoo! Right? It's great for the people that have money invested in the stock market. They're doing great. But there's there's another side to the coin. You know, we have to choose, and it's a hard choice, because if you say, well, no, we can't take I was on PBS NewsHour with Ali Noorani once, and Ali says, well, but nobody's really for no limits, right? No one's for unlimited immigration. Well, that's not exactly true, but we all understand that unlimited immigration is a hard sell. But the alternative of setting a limit and trying to enforce it is also a hard sell, because it means saying no to people who are not bad people, who remind us, in fact, of our own ancestors, and saying to them, you can't come in, not because you're a criminal, not because you're a national security threat. You can't come in because we have a numerical limit, and letting you in would violate that numerical limit. And if you come in violation of our limit, we're going to have to deport you. That's a hard thing to do. And I understand that people say, oh, that's too hard. I don't want to do that, right? Give me a third choice. Give me a third choice between no limit and enforced limit. Give me a third choice. Well, I don't think there is a third choice, but I think a lot of people in the country wish there was a third choice, and what they've come up with is this. Let's pretend we have a numerical limit. Let's keep the numerical limit on the books, but let's not enforce it, right? You think anyone will notice? We'll keep the limit on the books, so we don't have unlimited immigration. We have a limit, but we're not enforcing it. And every time we end up with a lot of people in the United States illegally, we'll just amnesty them, right? That'll solve the problem. Is that a real third choice? I don't think so. Here's the background. A new jobs report just came out today. It's on the front page of all the news websites. And it's always good news, right? Every month's job report is good news. A couple 100,000 jobs were created, 5.8%. But here's the bad news, right? That means there's still almost 20 million Americans who are unemployed, underemployed, or given up, discouraged, can't work. The unemployment rate for Black Americans is 10.9%. For American teenagers who are looking for work, the unemployment rate is 18.6%. For Black teenagers, the unemployment rate in the United States right now is 32.6%. We all know a lot of Americans, a lot of these jobs are part-time jobs. We know that wages are stagnant in the United States. We know that there's tremendous job security out there. Even the people that have jobs are scared and frightened, and that's partly what that election was all about. President Obama says inequality, rising inequality is tearing at the social fabric of America. Do you think so? Do you agree with President Obama on that, about rising inequality? Well, let me ask you, what is the impact on all these issues if we double immigration going forward? What is the impact on all these issues that we claim to care about if we legalize 11 million undocumented aliens in the United States and allow them to compete against Americans for jobs? The organization that I'm on the board of directors for, the Center for Immigration Studies, has published a number of studies showing that all the new jobs that are being created are overwhelmingly going to immigrants, not to Americans. So if you're satisfied with the rates of unemployment that we're having right now, if you're satisfied with rising inequality in America, you have to ask yourself, what does increasing immigration do to rising inequality in America? What does it do for Black teenagers who can't find jobs if they have to compete against rising numbers of immigrants? That, I think, is the real issue. And Asian Americans are not monolithic on issues like affirmative action, and I don't think we should be monolithic on immigration either. Thank you.
Jenny, would you like to start with 2 minutes saying whatever you like in response?
Sure. There is a lot to comment on. I guess most immediately, in response to what Professor Ting was just saying, I would say that maybe there is a way to be agnostic on the question of limits, in the sense that for many, many years, until very recently, the ACLU actually had no position at all, actually, on the substantive immigration question of how many people should be here, should there be legalization, not legalization, should we have open borders, not open borders. And what we have focused on for the decades of our organizational lifespan is just fairness in the immigration system. So you can agree that we have immigration laws generally should be enforced, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you agree with all of the government's policies in carrying out that enforcement. It doesn't mean that you think the laws on the books are constitutional. There could be a lot of ways in which the procedures that are being applied are unlawful and unconstitutional. And that's really where the ACLU has focused our efforts. The other quick comment I would make, if I can remember it, was that.
You can jump in later.
Yeah, I think I'll jump in later.
Amy?
Well, at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, we are often called derisively the U.S. Chamber of Compromise. So we always think there's another way. I don't think that there are just two choices. I think that when you talk about that tough choice about if we're going to set a number, if we're going to set a limit, it has to mean something. There's some things that we should consider we don't need limits on. Why do we need limits on the spouses and minor children of green card holders? They're also immediate relatives. Why do we need limits on the number of extraordinary ability foreign nationals who are the leaders of in their fields? Do we think that it'd be better if we somehow reduce that number? Like, there's very strict standards, so however many of those people are, we should welcome them. Do we think we should have limits on the number of outstanding professors and researchers? I just think that if you look at some concepts of who we should welcome without regard to number, we would in effect increase our immigration, but not double it, and we would leave ourselves with an enforceable, workable system. It wouldn't actually take that much. It's a definable number. It's not a bottomless pit of numbers to eliminate the employment-based backlog, for example. So I would look at it that there's always a way forward. I would also say that, caution you, that there'll be a report coming out next week contradicting the idea that all employment growth has been through immigrants, and we'll look forward to blogging on that.
I thought of my comment.
So let me start with a quick story. I was probably like a few years ago, 4 years ago, I'd been invited to be on the O'Reilly show. And they told me to come in before my segment so they could, so I could see the segment before. So before it, and Laura Ingraham was the guest host. Lovely, lovely person. Big supporter. And this, yeah. And the segment below, Laura Ingraham is interviewing Karl Rove. And Karl Rove is up there saying, the only reason immigration reform won't move forward is because the AFL is standing in the way of a rational work visa program. In order for our economy to work, we need a work visa program, and those darn labor goons are standing in the way, to paraphrase. I'm like, okay, so I'm standing outside the studio thinking, okay, how am I going to respond to this? If this is a line of questioning, this will be about, okay, how big should the guest worker program be, et cetera. So then I go and sit down, put the mic on, and Laura starts speaking in her very quiet, undertone way. She's otherwise yelling. And she says, how is it that you want to let in everybody? I can't believe that. And because, remember, she just agreed with Karl Rove that we need a guest worker program that meets the needs of our economy and our workforce. In other words, an expansion of a guest worker program. And the people standing in the way of that are labor. And then they have me on 2 minutes later and say, we've got too many immigrants and we don't need any more. So there's this incredible dissonance on the part of, I think, our opponents. And I'm specifically talking about somebody like Laura Ingraham, because they will say on one hand, this is all the fault of the far left, and then say on the other hand, you know what, we actually don't need any more workers. My point here is that the only person that's winning right now is the unscrupulous employer. So yesterday I was in Houston and I met with some construction leaders. And their problem is that, and this guy is paying $65,000 a year, overtime, and health insurance. He had somebody on his staff for 15 years. He got audited by ICE, and this person ended up being undocumented. You know what happened to that undocumented person? That guy had 2 kids, U.S. citizen kids, and was married to a U.S. citizen. He'd been here over 10 years. He didn't go back home. But what he had to do is go down the road to a labor contractor who was paying $10 an hour, no overtime, and no health insurance. You know, the only person who's winning in that situation is the unscrupulous labor contractor who's pushing down the wages of that individual, making sure that the person I was talking to is losing business because he can't compete, and pushing down the wages of every American worker in that industry. So we can talk about, you know, this number versus that number and have this, again, kind of very, very interesting and fascinating policy conversation. But at the end of the day, on the ground, in the real world, the only people that are winning are the folks who are able to exploit the immigrant worker and the American worker. So I feel like we can't get pulled into the kind of this is a zero-sum game and, you know, it's us versus them, because, you know, somebody's winning on the other side of that equation, and they're pretty happy with the status quo.
I want to say about the limits question. I mean, there are 2 disadvantages to trying to enforce a numerical limit on immigration. One is you have to keep out sympathetic people who just want a shot at the American dream, just like our ancestors did. You have to say no to them and keep them out in order to enforce your numerical limit. And the other hard thing about trying to enforce a numerical limit is you have to argue with everyone about who should get those visas, right? Because if you have a limited number of visas, who's going to get them? And that is an ongoing discussion, which is part of a numerically limited immigration system. As everyone knows who works with the immigration system, the numerical limit is set by a very complicated formula that's being tinkered with all the time and is the subject of much controversy. So that's part of the system. It's very complicated. It's not a simple numerical limit, but it is a limit. And let me also say that if we do nothing, if we get no immigration reform, we end up with the most generous legal immigration system in the world. This country, under the current system, gives out more green cards for permanent legal residence to immigrants in the United States than all the rest of the nations of the world combined. Most countries in the world don't even have green card programs. We have the most generous legal immigration system in the world. If Congress does nothing, we're stuck with the most generous legal immigration system in the world. Thank you very much. Last question for my fellow panelists is if you're not for unlimited immigration, which I think a coherent intellectual case can be made, what limit would you be willing to enforce? What limit would you be willing to say no to people who remind us of our own ancestors and say, we're not going to let you in. You're a good person, you just want to work hard, you want a shot at the American dream, but we have a numerical limit, there are reasons for it, we're concerned about the people that are here now, we want to ensure that they have jobs and don't have to compete with hardworking people like you who are going to take the jobs from them. What limit would you be prepared to actually enforce a limit and say no to people, turn people away, remove people who come in violation of that limit?
Jenny, did you have a...
Well, I did remember what I was going to say earlier and couldn't remember it. Now I remember it. It was just, which is partially responsive to what Professor Ting is saying, is just that it's a myth to say that our federal government is not enforcing the immigration laws. Under this administration, I think the numbers of deportations are up to 2 million, which is a huge number. It is more than far more than the previous administration. On the most recent question about, what sort of limits are you willing to enforce, it's not a satisfying answer, but I feel like, it's not my job to comment on that. As a civil rights litigator, I feel like my job is to make sure that whatever we're doing in that enforcement is going to be fair, that it satisfies due process. I would also say that, any system where you have a limit and you have to enforce it, it is generally the case in America today that it is not possible to have 100% enforcement for a resource reason. And so in that situation, then the question becomes, how do you use your enforcement resources? Who do you prioritize for enforcement? Who do you deprioritize? And I would say that I think that that is a perfectly good and in fact desirable normative goal, to deprioritize enforcement in some cases. And that could, for example, cover situations like our dreamers who are young Americans. You know, as the president said, they're Americans in their hearts and minds, in every way except for on paper. And I think that is a perfectly sensible and normatively desirable approach to take, because it is simply not possible for us to reach 100% enforcement.
I think that one of the things that our immigration law has to aspire to do is to create a legal way for individuals who want to come to the United States to come. It does not mean that the supply of lawful permanent resident status visas should equal the demand. But what we have today is a system where the next guy that wakes up in Guadalajara or Warsaw or Beijing or any place else in the world and says, I'm going to take my talents to South Beach, has no way to do it. Let's try to come up with a legal way and see what happens. A lot of people will follow the law. Most people, I would hope, would follow the law. But if we don't have a peg on the pegboard, people who are yearning to be free are not going to have any other alternatives. So I think that our opportunity to make the system work in part would be to create a guest worker program that is workable in the real world by real businesses, like your construction guy in Houston, and to tinker with some of the concepts of where we think we have to put these limits and where there don't have to be limits. I think it would make a difference.
I'd like to add that as a historical matter, we've always had a two-tier immigration policy. We've had a legal immigration policy where people come in according to the formal process, but we've also allowed people who come to the United States unlawfully and then do what we expect good immigrants to do, that is to say, work, form families, don't have criminal convictions. We have traditionally had a way for those people to stay in the United States through periodic systematic amnesties or individual amnesties. And so, given 10 or a dozen...
Amnesty.
I'm sorry?
Don't use the word amnesty.
Well, I just have to, I have to
vocabulary.
say it because it's what it is. We've had 10 or 12 of these in the last 100 years, and they're so systematic and they're so common that functionally, this has been our historic immigration policy, and it's become a lot more complicated in recent years, but this is what we've done in the past, and I don't think that it would be crazy to do it again. I think we are at the point where we are going to take questions from the audience. Is there a microphone that's going around? There are microphones back there, but here's a hand right now.
Well, just go ahead and ask your question.
I don't need a microphone. My name is Margaret Wong. I thought maybe you should go.
No, she's taking over.
Not a possibility.
I didn't mean to be rude. I'm just so touched by this. My name is Margaret Wong, W-O-N-G. Like you, I'm a foreign born. I came when I was 19, and I'm so impressed. I came years and years and years ago, and there was like 10, 20, 30, 80, and now look at this, awesome. Everybody look handsome, beautiful, have good jobs, major law firms, support 10,000. In my days, we had nothing. But I just will warn you all, because I'm in this business of immigration law. I made a lot of money from it. I'm now very rich. Look at my diamond rings and stuff. But I think the center of, I don't want to name Professor
Maybe I should
Ting.
become a lawyer.
Professor Ting, I think I debated against you all, and I think they're so dangerous, guys. So they hijacked the conversation. Watch, that's why I'm sitting right here. I watch how Professor Ting argues with Professor Chin, and I want the young audience on here, because until you know how to lead with debates, you won't become leaders. Watch them. One is 7 minutes, 7 minutes. One is the technocrat, 7 minutes, 7 minutes, how exclusion, blah, blah, blah. It's all fact-based agenda. Listen to Professor Ting and the two young ones in between. The Professor Ting is like, he didn't tell us what his position is, but hey, I'm 65 years old, I'm not dumb. I knew the first two sentences, I knew his agenda. My question is, Professor Ting, you should get rid of your board. You should not be associated with that center. They are dangerous. They teach you bad stuff. Your parents will be so disappointed. I would not give them a dime for this center. I debated against them. They're dangerous. You could hijack all four so smart. You're hijacking me. One of the people in this business. We won't let you argue limit versus no limit. They are not people in the field like I am.
All right.
The question is, I don't have a question. I'm so mad at you.
Thank you, Margaret.
I think I get to reply to that.
That was the hook.
If I can reply to that, I will. Anthony Romero, the head of the ACLU, is he still the head of the ACLU? I mean, Anthony and I were on a panel once, and over lunch we were talking, and Anthony said, well, I don't know whether he'll stand by this or not, but he said, the American people just have to get used to sequential amnesties. That we're going to have one amnesty, it'll attract more people in, we're going to have another amnesty. The American people just have to get used to it. I mean, that's a choice that we have to make. On the statistics, Obama's called the deporter-in-chief. And by the way, we were saying at lunch, I supported Obama both times. I not only voted for him, I sent him money both times. The majority of the board of directors of CIS were Obama supporters, right? The majority of CIS directors were Obama supporters. I mean, it's a combination of liberals who are concerned about the unemployed, who are concerned about the environment, who are concerned about conservation, and conservatives, right? It's a mix. But a lot of us are really concerned about the underclass, are concerned about inequality. So that's CIS. It's true that enforcement is impossible 100%. You're never going to get 100% employment. But I just want to say that a colleague of mine, former colleague of mine at Temple, used to say, and I remember saying it, the poor people of the world may be poor, but they are not stupid. They are as capable of doing cost-benefit analysis to determine what's in their own self-interest as anyone in this room, and they do it all the time. And in terms of immigration laws, the question is, if you want more immigration, more illegal immigration, all you have to do is lower the costs through less enforcement and increase the benefits. And you will get more illegal immigration, guaranteed. And that's why you're going to have sequential amnesties forever. Marco Rubio said something really stupid, I thought, when he said, we're going to deal with immigration once and for all, get it off our plates, never have to deal with it again. Stupid. We're always going to be dealing with immigration for the rest of our lives. It'll always be an issue for us. But if you want less illegal immigration, you have to raise the costs and lower the benefits. That's the only way, because people are smart, right? They can do cost-benefit analysis to figure out what's in their own best interest. The problem, as I said at the outset, is what do we want? Make up your minds. Whether you care about the unemployed in the United States, whether you care about black teenagers and African American unemployment, whether you care about rising inequality in the United States or not, make up your minds.
Two things. One, in addition to rising costs of illegal immigration and reduced benefits, there has to be a legal way for that profile of person to come here. No one in this room, well, I can't say that. I don't think there's very many people in this room who are for expanding illegal immigration. Secondly, I do have to just comment about the registry and other ongoing provisions that we've had in our immigration history, continuing to call them amnesty. In Washington, that's a bad word. And we would all be served to not really think about it in that way, much less talk about it. When there was the debate where Cornyn and Cuellar got together and tried to come up with a bill, which I'm sure the ACLU opposed, but there was an effort to try to address unaccompanied alien children at the border. Not only was there concern and opposition on the left, on the right, folks at the Center for Immigration Studies and others were saying, you're going to provide limited due process? You're going to deport children faster? Not fast enough? That's amnesty. This word is now being used essentially to include, not essentially, is being used to include the fact that Congress said that if you marry a U.S. citizen, you don't have to prove that you've been lawfully present in the United States. That's amnesty. Deporting children faster, but allowing them some limited due process, that's amnesty. So I would just suggest that we try to, I understand your point historically, and the point that some people try to think about it as it's just illegal immigration, we're gonna have to deal with it and do amnesty, but try not to.
Hi.
I have a comment. I just wanted to say that I agree with Ali that, you know, we don't have to think about it like a zero-sum game. It can be a situation in which immigrants are increasing the size of the pie. And I think just at a personal level for me, you know, what Amy said earlier about the fact that our system doesn't have a way for normal people in, you know, certain countries to come here legally. There literally is zero way for them to come. For me, that means, you know, when my parents came here in the 1960s, they wouldn't have been able to come. But they were able to come because things were different back then. And it does feel like, you know, as a matter of the heart, that our system needs to have a way for that to happen. And if we do have a way for that to happen, that doesn't mean that everyone in this room is gonna lose our jobs, or most of us, or some of us. And I don't like the tenor of the conversation when we're thinking about, is my job secure if this unaccompanied child is allowed to stay here? And then finally, I would just say that also personally, my job is very secure because Governor Brewer keeps me in a job. She keeps me very busy. All we do all day is sue the state of Arizona. My children are going to preschool and daycare, all paid for by Arizona. So thank you.
So, oops. Oh, so I have a question for Professor Ting, and I don't understand your comments about African Americans being underemployed because of immigrants. And haven't immigrants always been used as a scapegoat for labor issues? And what does your organization actually do to help underprivileged and underserved communities to make sure that they don't suffer from wage gaps and opportunity gaps?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think labor historians tell us that bosses have always used immigrants and rivalries between nationalities to keep wages down. I mean, that's a historical pattern in American history. So yes, that's true, but I think it begs the question of what our responsibility is during our time on Earth, right, as to what kind of immigration policies we ought to have. On the statistical question that some people call Obama the deporter-in-chief because he's gotten deportation levels up. But, documents have been leaked showing that's a deliberate policy on the part of the administration. They had a target of 400,000 deportations a year, and they achieve it by counting people who used to be voluntary departures who were not counted and doing what's called streamlining and running them through the court system so they can count them as deportations. It's a way of artificially raising the numbers. The New York Times has reported on their front page that the overall level of removals from the United States is not going up. It's actually going down in the current administration, notwithstanding the statistical numbers that are being raised. But I think, your concern about poor people in America is reflected in your position on immigration. Your position on inequality in America is reflected in your position on immigration. And if you're saying we ought to amnesty all these people, knowing that it's going to bring more people in, and amnesty is the right term. You know, I mean, Ronald Reagan called it amnesty. Congress called it amnesty in 1986. They knew what they were talking about. It is an amnesty. And if you know that it's going to attract more people because of the cost-benefit analysis, then how much concern do you really have for poor people in the United States? How much concern do you really have about rising inequality?
So, can I jump in? I love debating people from Center for Immigration Studies, because you're right, Margaret, you can never quite tell what their position is. Because I think you've made, like you said, an incredibly coherent case for completely open borders, and I'm fairly certain that's not your position.
But it could be. If you paid me, I could make that argument.
Okay. And then you've also made a case for addressing the needs of the poor, which I'm also fairly certain that that's not the position of the Center for Immigration Studies. So to answer your question, Margaret, since the professor hasn't been able to, my understanding of the position of CIS is to limit immigration, period. I mean, Mark Krikorian, the executive director, has written a book along those lines that says, I don't remember the title. He didn't give me a signed copy. Can you bring that up for me?
I have two.
Okay. You have two of yours. But in essence, his case is that we don't need more immigrants as a country. So, to answer the question that hasn't been answered, that's as far as I understand it, CIS's position. So what I think is that, number one, yes, unemployment has gone down, but labor force participation has gone down as well. The stock market is, is increasing. The economy continues to diversify, but wherever you go across the country, people are afraid. People are wondering if they're going to keep their job. They're wondering where their next job is going to come from. And more importantly, they're wondering what the future looks like for their kids. That's reality. And I think for those of us who care about people who are less fortunate than us, people who care about immigration reform, it is important that we acknowledge that reality. And because it scares the heck out of people. So if that's a reality for folks, what is a practical, reasonable, compassionate solution and way forward? First is we got to fix our education system. When you look at dropout rates among Latinos, African Americans, poor whites, those numbers are increasing. That's not because of immigrants and immigration. That's because our education system needs to be reformed on its own. We need to build the job skills of the workforce writ large, whether it's the workforce that's was born here in the States or the workforce that's coming over. I mean, Amy, I'm sure you can speak to the needs of the workforce moving forward. So there's an education issue, there's a workforce skills issue. Immigration reform is an asset to that, or is a net plus to where we're going as a country. You look at research, whether it's from Cato or the Center for American Progress, we're talking billions and over $1 trillion in growth over 10 years. So these are real numbers. But for us to be sucked into a debate about enforcing limits or, what do we really care about, it starts to insert a policy conversation, policy elements into, at the end of the day, what I think is a cultural debate. And who we are, what we believe in as a set of values, and how do we make sure that all of us can reach our fullest potential.
And I think that's going to have to be the last word. So please join me in thanking the panel for a great discussion.